Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. My name is Elivaras, head mentor on Guild Wars 2 Raid Academy, and today I am here to bring you my updated guide to support Chronomancer in raids for Guild Wars 2. This guide is going to follow a very similar structure to the last one, starting off with a discussion about gear, then going into traits, and then finally talking about the rotation and opener. So sit back, relax, grab a snack, and get ready to get right into the action. Alright, so let's talk about gear. Gearing for Chronomancer has changed quite a bit, and for two main reasons. The first reason is the introduction of Diviner's gear. This is a gear set from PvP that gave main stat of concentration and power with an off stat of precision and ferocity. So as you can see, it's a very DPS focused gear set, and it also provides a huge amount of concentration as well. Before, you'd run Commanders and Berserkers mix, and you can see here that Commanders has concentration as the off stat and does not provide any ferocity, so no critical damage increases. Additionally, it provides toughness, which for an off chrono is not generally needed. So Commanders was always wasting a bit of stats, but it was kind of the best we had. Now, with Diviner's gear, you get a main stat of power and precision, or a power and concentration, and an off stat of precision and ferocity. So it's super worth your while to get Diviners when you can. The other major change was to the Signet of Inspiration. Back in the day, Signet of Inspiration would take any boons that were on you and apply them to all nearby allies when pressed, and that's scaled based on boon duration. Now, it no longer does this. It increases the duration of boons on allies around you by 5 seconds. It does not apply any new boons to allies around you. Additionally, this 5 seconds does not scale on boon duration. What this has meant is that boon duration is not as worthwhile to run with as a chrono. Now, for new players, I would still recommend trying to get as much boon duration as possible. If you're a new chrono, you don't want to screw over your raid group because you don't know your rotation and you're running very low boon duration. All right, if you're learning your rotation and you're running in training runs, the group in a training run still wants to get a kill. While it may not be required and it may not be the main goal of the training, you still want to positively impact your group and not drag them down. So while you're learning your rotation, while you're getting used to things, it's worthwhile to invest in a lot of boon duration. Now, as you start to get more experienced, you can start to pull this level of boon duration down from 100 to 90 to 80, 70, 60, and then stopping at around 50. At around 50, you tend to be able to comfortably maintain 100% boon uptime on your allies, assuming your run is going smoothly. This 50 would include food. So in this case, I'm at 47.8 without any food, and with Elutioned Oil, I could get it up to maybe about 60%. Okay, so how do you go about getting this boon duration? Before, it would be through runes, through your Sigil of Concentration, and through Commander's gear. Now, it's pretty similar. The main runes you run have changed a bit, and let's talk about that first. So runes. Here you can see I am still running leadership runes, and I still have Commander's pieces that I haven't switched out yet, which I will eventually, but you can still see I'm running leadership runes. Leadership runes are still amazing. They still provide 25% boon duration, which is huge. That is the biggest reason why leadership runes are still here, because 25% is a crazy amount of boon duration. Another rune set that you might have seen come into popularity recently was runes of the Firebrand. And if I look up these on the TP, rune of the Firebrand, you will see here that they provide 10% boon duration and 30% quickness duration. Why this works is because if you look at your main skills on your skill bar here, you have Tides of Time, Well of Action, Well of Recall, and Time Warp. Now, Time Warp is not going to be up very often. About 3 double weapon swaps will get you back to Time Warp being available through your Continuum split. But those 3 weapon swaps, 3 sets of weapon swaps in between, you're only going to have Tides of Time, Well of Recall, and Well of Action. And you can see that because Tides of Time gives Alacrity, Well of Recall gives Alacrity, and Well of Action only gives Quickness, that you have much more Alacrity uptime or output than you do Quickness in your general rotation. What this means is that Alacrity output is not as essential as Quickness output. This is why you can run Firebrand runes, because they provide an extra 30% quickness duration on top of the 10% boon duration, allowing you to more even out the alacrity and quickness that you're providing with your 3 skills in your general rotation when your time warp is on cooldown. Right? So leadership and Firebrand are very heavy contenders to be run for a Chronomancer. Now, those of you who keep up to date with Snow Crows knows that they have put pack runes as the rune set for support Chronomancer. And there's a few reasons for this, but I would not recommend a new Chronomancer to run pack runes. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of pack runes, but I know why they did it. Snow Crows is a guild based around optimal compositions, not wasting any stats, trying to get speed clears, everything as fast as possible, right? So one of the ways they achieve that is through running only one druid. Now, what is it that a druid provides to only 5 members of the group? Because we have spirits, and they affect 10 people. So that's why you only have one druid running spirits. So what boons do they provide to only 5 people? Well, Might, Fury, and Swiftness. So how are we going to still give our members a high uptime of Might, Fury, and Swiftness if we're only running one druid? Well, the answer to that is pack runes. So if I type in Superior Rune of the Pack, you can see here that it gives 15% boon duration, but also grants nearby allies 5 stacks of Might, Fury, and Swiftness for 8 seconds while in combat, with an internal cooldown of 30 seconds. If I'm running Improved Alacrity as a trait in my Chronomancer line, middle column, bottom skill, this will have the cooldown to 15. Additionally, with 50% boon duration, that's 12 seconds, and with 100%, that's 16. So I can provide effectively a very high amount of Might, Fury, and Swiftness uptime for my subgroup by just running pack runes. And this is how you would do that if you're only running one druid. But in reality, you shouldn't be running only one druid. You can run one druid if you're in a dedicated static or a speed clear group that's trying to get super fast kills, that's trying to make things as optimal as possible. But for general purpose raiding, you should generally have 2 druids in your group. So that 6th slot from pack runes is not necessary, and this is why I will not be recommending pack runes for general use as a chrono. Now, if you're going to be running with a static, if you're going to be trying for speed clears, then grabbing a set of pack runes might not be a bad idea. You can run them if you really want to, but personally, I would suggest getting something like Leadership runes or Firebrand runes as my main 2 contenders. And I'll talk about tanking in a second. So with these runes, I can bump up my boon duration quite a bit. Additionally, I can run Superior Sigil of Concentration on my main hand sword, or my offhand weapons as well. Now that it doesn't cost so much as it did back in the day, that's more of an economic choice now. So I could run it on both. Now, one thing to note is that you cannot run 10% on your main hand sword and your offhand sword and get 20. It's only 10. It doesn't stack like that. So don't think it does, and don't invest in 2. So I get 10 plus the percent from my runes. Now the rest is going to come from food. If you have the Lucient Oil, that is the best one that you want to pick up as quickly as possible. And additionally, it's going to come from your gear. Now, the gear set you now want to be building as a support Chronomancer is Diviners. Diviners, as I said previously, gives a main stat of concentration, along with power and off stats of precision and ferocity. So you want to aim for whatever boon duration you're looking for, whether you're a super new chrono that wants to put it between 80 and 100 or an experienced chrono at 50, you want to fill in the rest of that boon duration with Diviner's gear. Once you're filled up to whatever boon duration you're looking for, then you can start filling in the rest. And I would say with Assassins to get up to about 70% crit chance. When you're at about 70% crit chance, including food, slash utilities. Although your utility should be Elution Oil, so that won't affect your precision. But if you're running like a power-based food, once you're at about 70, I would stop getting Assassin's Gear and start speccing into Berserkers. Once you're at 70, with Fury, you'll be at 90. And that is a pretty safe place to be in terms of critical chance. And then you can just stack more Berserkers for more power. So that is how I would gear your general purpose support chrono. I would start with the Superior Sigil of Concentration, run something like Leadership or Firebrand runes, then spec into Diviners until I'm at the boon duration I want, plus including food, and then get Assassins up to about 70% crit chance, and then Berserkers the rest of the pieces. And whether you want to do that by, like in this case, I have full Assassin's Trinkets, but whether you want to do that by Assassin's Gear and like Diviner's Trinkets or Diviner's Weapons or Assassin's Weapons or Berserker's Weapons, whatever it is, just aim for the percentage you want, aim for the percentage of crit chance you want, and then fill in the rest as you see or as need be. Now for tanking, you can still run Minstrels if you want, but full Minstrels is typically overblowing it a bit. Although if you're a new chrono, and you happen to have easy access to full Minstrels, then by all means go ahead and put it on. But you can generally be pretty safe without a ridiculously high amount of toughness. I would get a rune set, something like Water or Sanctuary runes. These provide a very high amount of boon duration while also providing a very high amount of self-sustain. You can run durability, however, because of their recent nerf, they only give 15% boon duration instead of 20 as it was previously, so they're not as strong as they were before, and so I'd recommend something like Water or Sanctuary. For gear, you kind of throw in toughness as you see necessary. I have a set of Minstrel's Trinkets, and I'll kind of like throw these in to bump up my toughness as I see necessary. Like for general purpose tanking, you generally don't need much more than 14 to 1600, so I might throw on like 2 Minstrel's Trinkets and that'll be my tanking setup. But for high toughness fights, I might throw on all my Minstrel's Trinkets, and then maybe a Minstrel's piece or 2. You could also put on other toughness pieces like Commanders, or you could put on Minstrel's pieces or Giver's pieces for budget or whatever as you see fit. All right, so that's tanking. Now your off sigil, generally I'd recommend to run the Force Sigil just for more damage. So that is going to cover it for gear, and now let's start talking about traits. So one thing I want to note as a bit of an addendum to this section before I move on is weapons. All right, so generally the weapons you're going to be using as a support chrono have not changed much. Generally, it's going to be sword, and sword, shield. You'll additionally swap in a focus for sword when you need pulls. So whether that's like Sabbatha or Slothazor, where you want to pull in adds and cleave them down super quickly, you'll run focus instead of offhand sword. You always want shield for that extra alacrity and the blocks, and the extra DPS from phantasms that we'll get into later. So it's sword, and sword shield, or sword focus, sword shield are your general weapons. Now in some cases, you can run greatsword. Now, these cases are pretty slim, but there are a few. Now, one case that you're going to want to run Greatsword, and in this case, you're going to be running Greatsword combined with Sword Shield, is, for example, doing greens on VG. You're going to be spending a large majority or a large percentage of the fight away from the boss, not able to DPS with your sword. So having Greatsword in that scenario is definitely worthwhile. Greatsword provides very excellent range damage, especially with some trait adjustments that I will talk about in the upcoming traits section. But you can actually do quite a hefty amount of damage with Greatsword, and it's better than the 0 you're doing from range for a lot of the fight at VG. Now, another case when you might run Greatsword is, for example, let's say you're on Cairn, and normally you'd run 2 healers and a kiter, and you have those 2 healers kite Agony. But say you couldn't find 2 healers and a kiter, so one of the healers is kiting, which means you need an extra person taking Agony from the group. Generally, that's going to be one of the chronos. So if you're a chrono that's taking Agony, you cannot stand on top of the boss, therefore sword is useless. In that scenario, you're going to want to run Greatsword. So you can kind of get the gist of what I'm saying here. If there are scenarios where you are going to be kind of away from the boss, then I would run Greatsword instead of Sword. And you can kind of piece out the rest of the scenarios where Greatsword might be useful. Alright, so now let's talk about traits. back in the day, chaos was what you wanted to run in basically all circumstances. And a lot of that was because of how Signet of Inspiration worked. You could get Might, Vigor, Fury, Regen, Resistance, and Stability, and then share it to your group. But now, because Signet of Inspiration only extends boons already existing on allies, this skill has gone to basically garbage. And there is almost no circumstance that you would be running Chaos now, unless you deem the personal stability really worthwhile. Which personally, I don't think it is, because you have lots of blocks and stuff like Distorts at your disposal. Additionally, with changes to blurred inscriptions, you'll also have extra distortion, so generally you should not be running Chaos. So what will you run instead? Well, first of all, Chronomancer and Inspiration are basically your two main lines that, again, you'll almost never be changing. This has not changed since my last guide. However, the traits you run in these lines, in particular for Chronomancer, has changed a bit. So first of all, the very first line of Chronomancer here is Delayed Reactions, Time Catches Up, and All's Well That Ends Well. And you can look at those traits as I mouse over them here. Now, one thing I'd like to note is there a very important distinction between interrupting a foe and disabling a foe. And I will note this by an experiment on the golem here. So first you can see interrupting a foe slows them and grants you alacrity. Okay, so any interrupt on a foe will slow them and grant me alacrity. Alright, so this guy's got a break bar. You can see I just used a hard CC and I did not gain any, or he did not get any slow. This is because interrupts only apply on bosses when they lose their break bar. Thus, this skill is essentially useless. All right, but now let's take a look at lost time. Strike and slow your target. And then lost time is cast when I disable a foe. So instead, let's disable a foe. I use my shield 5. Even though he had a break bar, he got slowed. So as you can see, lost time will slow because it uses disables, whereas delayed reactions will not because it uses interrupts. So all this is to say, delayed reactions is a useless trait on the first line, and there's almost no reason you should be running it in the raiding context. So now that leaves us with Time Catches Up and All's Well That Ends Well. If you're in a boss fight where where the extra healing from your wells is not needed, then you'll run Time Catches Up for extra damage. Otherwise, if you feel the healing would be useful, if you're tanking, for example, then run All's Well That Ends Well. Now the second line, there's actually two heavy contenders here. Improved Alacrity and Danger Time. Danger Time says gain additional critical hit chance against slowed enemies, and critical hits deal additional damage to slowed enemies. So I gain 10% critical damage increase and 30% critical chance increase if my enemy is slowed. This is a super useful trait for support Chrono. And if you ever have, or for Power Chrono, and if you ever have a Power Chronomancer in your group, you're going to be wanting to run Lost Time as your Grandmaster to help put slow on the boss so that your Power Chrono can benefit from Danger Time. Generally, as a support Chrono, you will be running Improved Alacrity. However, if you're on a very immobile boss, or your static is or your group is very experienced, whether that's a static or just a group of friends you run with occasionally, or like a raid training guild or Discord, the groups you run with there, you may not need Improved Alacrity. Instead, you want to bump up your DPS. To do that, you can run Danger Time. Now, with Danger Time, it should be noted that if you're ever running this trait, generally you're going to want to run Lost Time, because there's not many classes other than Condition Renegade that are going to be putting slow on the boss. So if you're going to be running Danger Time, you need the boss to have slow on them. So in that case, running Lost Time is almost mandatory. Now, if you general purpose scenarios, you're going to be running Improved Alacrity, and if that's the case, you will pick either Chronophantasma or Lost Time. Now, back in the day, you'd run Seize the Moment because you could share that with Signet of Inspiration. But now that isn't there, so Seize the Moment isn't really that worthwhile anymore. You don't really need that quickness on you. Instead, you'll run Chronophantasma for extra damage, as you can resummon phantasms that do a whole bunch of damage. Or you can run Lost Time. And you'll do this if you have Power Chronomancers in your group. Okay, so now let's talk about Inspiration. So Inspiration has generally not changed at all. Sympathetic vid, if you really want to dive into these, you can look through the different traits, but generally it has not changed since my last guide, and they're pretty straightforward. Gain condition, your phantasms take conditions from you, you get heals whenever you shatter, and you lose conditions. And then blurred inscriptions is the big one here. This is the change since the last time I made this guide. Signets have improved active effects, and activating one grants you distortion. Back in the day, this trait was in the domination line, and it provided different effects. Now, it increases, it like buffs all of your signets and gives you distortion when you use one. And the big one here is Signet of Inspiration. Increases the number of allied targets to 10. So now, this allows Signet of Inspiration to affect 10 targets. And generally, you absolutely need this trait. Without this trait, your Signet only affects 5, making it much less worthwhile to run. Back in the day, when you summoned a Phantasm, it would use a Signet of Inspiration for you, and you could have 4 Signets of Inspiration. But now, Phantasms don't use Signets of Inspiration anymore. But you can increase yours to 10. So instead of getting 4 5-man Signet of Inspirations, each Chrono gets 2 10-man. So it's required to run this trait. The only exception to this is potentially bosses where you spend a significant amount of time separated from the main group, or if your group is split into 5. And this would be, for example, in Largos. In Largos, you might not want to run this trait line. However, there's not really that many other great traits you can run to try and increase boon uptime anymore because of the changes to Signet of Inspiration. So, except for potentially illusions, which we will talk about. So you might want to run illusions in Largos, but other than that, you are always going to run this inspiration line. So Chaos, as I mentioned, because you can no longer share these boons, it's basically garbage. So don't run Chaos. The other 3 contenders here are Illusions, Dueling, Domination. I'd like to mention that Dueling, for general purpose use, is going to be your go-to line. It's a DPS-focused line, and the traits you're going to want to run are 1, 3, 1. The reason for this, if you look through the traits, is generally you're going to be having your sword as main hand, and so Fencer's Finesse is great, giving stacking Frosty while wielding a sword. Additionally, you get more critical hit chance, bonus critical hit damage with Superiority Complex, and your Phantasms have Fury. This will be your major DPS. If you look through the rest of these traits, they don't really do anything that great for you based on the skills and weapons that you're running. Now, Domination. All right, this is a CC-focused line, and the main reason for that, well, the only reason you're generally running this is for 2 reasons. Confounding Suggestions for extra CC, which, to be honest, if you need this, if this is the difference between your group's success on a breakbar or not, you have some larger problems in your group. So, to be honest, I wouldn't really run Domination purely for CC. Your group should be able to maintain their CC. What I would run Domination for is if you are running Greatsword, and previously I mentioned the areas that you're going to want to run Greatsword in. So if you're running Greatsword, you're going to want to take Domination instead of Dueling for this skill mainly. Imagine Burden. Greatsword skills other than the Spatial Surge gain Recharge Reduction and Inflict Cripple. Also, Phantasmal Berserkers summons an additional Berserker but deals less damage. So it's 25% damage reduced, but you get 2 of them, which is 2 Berserkers that potentially both get respawned with Chrono Phantasma, and they turn into clones. So that's a lot of clones, a lot of damage, a lot of Berserkers, a lot of nastiness for the enemy. Additionally, for extra damage, you'd run Egotism and Illusions. And if you really, really, really need that CC badly, you can run Confounding Suggestions, but personally, your group should not be in that dire straits. Alright, so run this build run Domination if you are bringing a Greatsword. Illusions is the last line here. Now, the big thing for Illusions is this minor trait right here, Master of Misdirection. Shatter skills gain reduced recharge reduction, or gain recharge reduction. So Continuum Split drops from, if I switch out, 105 seconds to 89 and a quarter seconds. So this is actually quite good. It's a good 15 second cooldown, or 15 and 3/4 seconds cooldown on Continuum Split as it is normally, allowing it to actually slot quite nicely into your main rotation. So If you're looking for extra boon uptime, this is the line you want, and it's mainly because of that reduced continuum split cooldown with Master of Misdirection. The skills you're probably going to be running here are going to help increase DPS while running this line. Phantasmal Force for increased damage from your phantasms. This line is actually pretty garbage overall. You could give phantasms quickness, you could get some personal quickness. Shatter skills inflict torment on hit generally for DPS. This isn't really that useful. But then the big one in the main line here is Shatter Storm. You get 2 Mind Racks. And this allows you to just get overall more damage if you use a great... Well, actually, you won't be using a greatsword with illusions. But it just basically allows you to do a little bit more damage and give yourself some more alacrity if you're in real dire straits. So illusions is for extra boon duration. Dueling is for extra DPS. With sword, domination is for greatsword and sometimes CC. And if you're on Largos and you don't want to run inspiration because you spend half the fight without your friends, then I would run illusions and dueling instead. So that's going to cover our discussion on traits. And now let's get into the rotation. Alright, so now we're going to finally get into the rotation. The rotation has not changed too much, especially in the way that I'm going to be explaining it. And the general rotation stays the same for the most part. I'm going to try and keep this as broken down as possible. I'm going to start off with the very, very basics, assuming you know nothing about the chrono rotation, and slowly build in more complexity so you can follow along as you're watching. Alright, so let's say we're here starting on Sword. I'm not going to cover the opener yet. I will be covering that after. But first, I'm starting on Sword. The bread and butter of your rotation is your Well of Action, your Well of Recall. You can swap weapons here. You can use your Tides of Time, and then your Inspiration after both your Wells have finished. Alright, I'm here on Sword Shield. I can swap back to Sword. I can Phantasmal Swordsman. I can heal skill to refresh. And then Phantasmal Swordsman again. Alright, so that is my general rotation. Now I'm back here. I'm going to use both my Wells again. I can swap weapons, use that Tides of Time. And then I can also Signet of Inspiration once the Wells are finished. You may have to make sure the Wells are finished. Otherwise, your allies will not have Quickness and Alacrity on them. Alright? And if they don't have Quickness and Alacrity on them, your Signet of Inspiration does nothing. So that's the general rotation, right? You use both your Wells, you can swap your weapons, use your Tides of Time, Signet of Inspiration. Actually, let's just go over it one more time here then. We can use both our Wells, can swap weapons, Tides of Time, and then Signet of Inspiration once the Wells are finished. Now I'm here, I'm just kind of auto-attacking, not really doing too much, don't want to complicate it yet. And then I can go back to Sword when it's off cooldown, swap weapons, use Sword 5, heal Sword 5 again, as you can see here, for more DPS. And then now that my Wells are coming off cooldown, I can use my Wells again, swap weapons, Shield 5, and Signet of Inspiration once the Wells are finished. Alright, so that's the general rotation. Now let's start adding in some more complexity to that, and refining it a bit. Alright, so let me... Actually, I don't really need to get out of combat. I'll just refresh my stuff here. So now, let's say we are back over here. We're using both our Wells. We're swapping weapons. We're on Shield. Using Shield 5. Once the Wells are finished, I'm going to use Inspiration. Alright, so now I'm here. Right, let's take a snapshot at this moment. Alright, let's say the weapon swap was still about 4 seconds left. I have Well of Action, Well of Recall on cooldown, Signet of Inspiration's on cooldown. We're ignoring Time Warp for now because that's with Continuum Split in your opener. We'll talk about that later. But this is on, all of these are on cooldown. My Tides of Time is on cooldown, my weapon swap's on cooldown. What is my priority here? Well, first priority is going to be your Echo of Memory, especially if you're using Chrono Phantasma as your trait, right? This double summons your phantasms. So get this Echo of Memory out. Your Avenger will spawn, he will hit, put some slowness on. The second one will spawn if you're running Chrono Phantasma. This is especially valuable if you're running Danger Time or helping out your Power Chronos. So Echo of Memory is pretty high importance. It also doesn't last super long, so it doesn't take a ridiculously long time, especially with quickness. And if you're tanking, Echo of Memory is obviously very useful. So Echo of Memory is now down. We still have extra time based on the snapshot we took. So what else? What is our priority now? Now our priority is Blurred Frenzy, right? If this is on off cooldown, we want to be using it. It does a very high amount of damage, and it happens in a very short amount of time. So Blurred Frenzy is next highest priority. After that, now all of this is down. Echo of Memory is down. Blurred Frenzy is down. Then Illusionary Leap. This allows me to summon another clone that I can then shatter for more damage. And then Blurred Frenzy had come off cooldown, so I can use it again. All right, so here's my priority. If everything else is down, my boon skills are down, weapon swaps down, then Echo of Memory first priority, especially with Chronophantasma, then Blurred Frenzy, then Illusionary Leap, then autos. And another note about auto attacks, like if you just look at my auto attacks here, I'm doing 1200, 1300, 3500. The third attack does the most damage. So it's very, very important that I try to not cut off my third auto. Try and start attacks or animations or things after you finish this third attack. So if I'm, summoning Wells, for example, I want to wait. There's the third. All right, I screwed it up there. As you can see, I missed my third attack by casting right at the end. Now, let's see. Okay, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Then I can use, skills like this. So try and make sure you're not cutting off your third auto. All right, now let's say I'm on Sword. I've just swapped over to Sword. I want to use Sword 5, Heal Skill, Sword 5 again. All right, now let's say all this stuff is on cooldown. Now, generally, as the optimized version of this rotation, you're going to want to wait for your third Phantasmal Swordsman before swapping back to Shield. This ensures that your Shield 5 will be off cooldown when you swap back to Sword Shield. So you want to Phantasmal Swordsman as soon as you swap over, Heal Skill, Swordsman again, then fill time while you're waiting for the third Swordsman to come off cooldown. Then use it, then weapon swap back to Sword Shield. All right, but let's say I'm in that period where I'm waiting to weapon swap back to Sword Shield. Generally, when I come back to Sword, and I've used Phantasmal Swordsman, Heal Skill, Phantasmal Swordsman, these 3 skills will be coming off cooldown. So I can use those 3. But then what? While I'm waiting for the third Phantasmal Swordsman. We're going to follow a priority list once again. The first priority here is Blurred Frenzy. All right, we don't have another Phantasm spawner, so Blurred Frenzy for some good damage very, very quickly. Then it's Illusionary Leap, because this summons a clone that I can shatter. But if the boss is attacking, and is very actively attacking, and you're going to get hit by those attacks, Sword 4 might be another good option to very quickly summon another clone. And that is something you can actually do at the start of a fight to give you an extra clone if you know the boss attacks very quickly. An example of this is Soulless Horror. If you know the boss, and Soulless Horror normally attacks right away, you can immediately Sword 4 to get an extra clone up at the start of the fight. And that will help your opener. But regardless, your priority list for Sword, assuming everything else is down, weapon swaps down, Heal Skill, Phantasmal Swordsmen are down, right? Blurred Frenzy, then Illusionary Leap, potentially Riposte, but then Auto Attack. All right, if there's nothing to block, then don't bother with Riposte, and just auto. And as before, you want to try and make sure you're hitting that last part of your auto attack before using animations. All right, so now let's hop into the boss here with some of that optimization in mind. So I'm going to start off with my classic, assuming I've just done my opener. Here I'm swapping over, going here, and there we go. So now I've just summoned all these abilities. Right now I'm going to use Shield 4. Summon that. 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to use my Sword 3, and now I can swap over. Sword, Heal Skill, Sword, and I've got some clones up. I can shatter that. Right now I'm here. This stuff's off cooldown. Now I've got my Wells up. Now I can throw my Wells down, and then I'm waiting for this guy to come off cooldown. So I can spawn some clones. I can use Signet of Inspiration. Now he's off cooldown. I can use him and swap over to Shield. Right, so that's very hard to talk through very quickly, but you can kind of see the general purpose of my rotations here. So there's 3. I'm going to use that. Now my weapon swaps off cooldown. Sword 5, Heal Skill, Sword 5. This stuff's off cooldown. I can use both my Wells. So now 1, 3, and then I'm going to use Signet of Inspiration. 2, 3, and then Sword 2. I'm going to shatter while I'm doing this. 2, 3, and then I'm going to use my Swordsman, and then I'm going to swap over to Tides of Time. So as you can see, I'm waiting for 3 Swordsmans. Right, another optimization you can do. Generally, you're going to be shattering. You're going to be using Mind Rack whenever you have 2 or 3 clones up. Now, with illusions, I have a little bit more leeway with this. I can do it with like one clone up. You could even do one clone on other lines, but generally I'd recommend to wait for 2 or 3 clones, unless it's going to be a long time before you get your 2 or 3 clones, in which case you might as well shatter, since it doesn't have that long of a cooldown. If I'm not running illusions, then generally that's what I'll do. I'll wait for 2 or 3. If I'm running dueling, for example, I'll only have one version of Mind Rack. But whenever you use Mind Rack, your clones are all exploding, and you can immediately follow up with Cry of Frustration. It doesn't do much damage, so you generally don't want to use this as your main attack when you have clones up. But if you immediately follow Mind Rack with Cry of Frustration, that is a little bit of a DPS increase. Alright? So every time you use Mind Rack, follow it up with Cry of Frustration if it's there. Generally, you're going to be saving Diversion for CC, Distortion for Shatter. However, you can use Diversion if you need extra Alacrity and there's not many CC phases coming up. Alright, so that's your general purpose rotation. To hop into it one more time, we are going to be, let's say, double wells here. Swapping weapons, shield 5. When the wells finish, 2, 3, I'm going to use Inspiration. Now, 1, 2, 3, I'm going to use shield 4. I'm going to immediately follow up with Blurred Frenzy. I'm going to use my clone, swap weapons, sword 5, heal skill, sword 5 again, 1, 2, 3, and then use sword 2. I'm going to follow it up with a well. I'm going to shatter and Cry of Frustration, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to use this. I'm going to Blurred Frenzy. Now this guy's off cooldown, so I'm going to use him. I'm going to swap shield 5, Signet of Inspiration. Now, if I'd done that faster, I would have still had quickness on me, but I didn't because I was talking through it. But you can see the general idea behind the rotation now. Alright, so with that covered, let's now go into the opener. And this is the best part of the chrono rotation. Alright, so the opener. You can either start on Sword Sword or Sword Shield. If the boss attacks really quickly, you might want to start on Sword Sword to get an extra clone with your Sword 4. Additionally, you can start with Sword 5 to give you an extra Phantasm. Now, you do have to be careful, because while this Phantasm will turn into a clone, if I'm using Chrono Phantasma, it'll take twice as long before this Phantasm turns into a clone, delaying your starting rotation. But if you really need a double clone continuum split, then even if you have Chrono Phantasma, I'd recommend waiting for your Phantasmal Swordsman or an attack to block with, plus your Illusionary Leap, which will give you the one clone that you normally use. Additionally, there's like a fancy trick you can do with like a staff where you can summon a clone at the start of the fight, but you don't go into combat yet, so you can quickly swap weapons back to your main weapon set off of staff. So you can try that as well if you want to be extra fancy, but I don't generally bother with that. Normally, I will do the one clone continuum split, which means I can start on Sword Shield and start with a Sword 3. So what is my goal here? And this is quite an intricacy and something that's very important to understand. Right? When we're using Continuum Split, we're not just throwing down things mindlessly and trying to fit as many boon cooldowns in here as possible. While that is one of our goals, the order of skills and the reason we're using them in that order is very, very important. First of all, we're going to go in on Tides of Time. You can go in on Tides of Time or Time Warp, the reasons which I'm going to explain in a second, but I would recommend doing it on Tides of Time because it has 3/4 of a second cast time as opposed to Time Warp's 1/4. Right? Back in the day, normally you'd go in on like Sword 5 and you'd wait till the very end of that cast animation to go in. You're still doing that here, and Tides of Time gives you a longer time to time that correctly than Time Warp does, meaning it's less likely you're going to screw up and accidentally put your Time Warp on a huge cooldown, which is very detrimental. Okay, so generally I'd recommend going in on Tides of Time. Now, why are we starting with Tides of Time and Time Warp? This is very important. If I want to use Signet of Inspiration, my allies need to have the boons on them already. Wells will not do that. Right? I need to wait for the wells to finish. So if I use wells before Continuum Split, well, now I can't use them in Continuum Split. So that was kind of a waste. If I use them in Continuum Split, right, first, well, they're not going to finish by the end of Continuum Split. So I won't be able to use Inspiration. So how am I going to get 10-man quickness and alacrity right away in order to use the Signet of Inspiration? The way I'm going to do that is with Tides of Time and Time Warp. And a note here is generally 95% of the time, you should be running Time Warp as your elite. In some cases, one chrono in your group may run gravity well for extra CC, but usually you want your allies to be carrying that CC, since time warp is a super huge part of maintaining good quickness as a chrono now. But regardless, Tides of Time can hit 10 people, and Time Warp will also hit 10. So this is a way to give instant 10-man Alacrity and Time Warp and Quickness that I can immediately follow up with my Signet of Inspiration to extend, and then use both my wells to finish. Now, the order of my wells is very important as well, because a one-clone Continuum Split is very, very, very tight, and sometimes I don't get everything inside of it. Now, if Well of Action is my last skill, then if I screw up a bit, mess up the timings, then I will not get Well of Action inside Continuum Split, meaning I can only cast it once. If Well of Recall is my last skill, then the same thing could happen with Recall. Now, which one is more detrimental for me to lose? Well, remember, I have more sources of Alacrity in the general rotation because of my Tides of Time than I do Quickness. So as a result, I do not want Well of Action to be my last skill, and instead I want to go with Well of Recall as my very last skill. So I want to start with instant 10-man Alacrity and Quickness so I can use this inspiration inside Continuum Split. Then I want to Well of Action, then Well of Recall. And I'm going to be going in on Tides of Time. So again, when I go in, I'm going to want to wait till the very end of that bar charging up for when I enter Continuum Split. Any animation or any skill that goes on cooldown after Continuum Split is cast, so while I'm in Continuum Split, will be reset when I leave. Tides of Time does not go on cooldown until it's finished casting, and that's generally the rule for all skills with a long cast. So you can see here, if I was to go through it, I'd go 5 into Continuum Split, Time Warp, Signet of Inspiration, double wells, and there we go, and I managed to fit everything in. Now I'm out of Continuum Split, I can shield again, I can use both of these wells, I can swap to sword, heal skill, sword again, but generally I'd want to Signet of Inspiration before that to immediately put it on cooldown, because I don't want to be waiting super long for that. Alright, so that is what your opener is going to look like. And note that you'll never really use Time Warp outside of Continuum Split because it has double the cooldown of Continuum Split, especially if you're running illusions. This will be at like 90 seconds. But still, you'll generally never drop cooldown or Time Warp outside of Continuum Split unless, alright, this is a big unless you're at the very end of the fight and you're not going to hit your next Continuum Split cooldown. So that's the opener. Let's take one look again. Start with Tides of Time, follow it up with Time Warp, Signet of Inspiration, Well of Action, Well of Recall, in that order because of the reasons I mentioned before. So again, I'm going to start off by summoning one clone, and if you want to, you can start on Sword, use your Sword 4, your Phantasm, wait for it to turn into a clone as well, and then swap to Shield. But now that I'm on Shield, I'm going to Sword 5, go in, Time Warp, Inspiration, double wells. All right, and there you see I missed it from Well of Recall. But I'm going to use Time Warp, or not Time Warp, the Shield Wall. I'm going to use Well of Action, Signet of Inspiration, and then I can swap to Shield, or Sword, heal skill, Sword again, and then I'm following my general rotation here. I'm back on Sword, and I can use my 2 wells, and use my skills in the order of priority, use my Sword 5, swap back to Shield, and Inspiration. You can see I'm part of my general rotation here. One thing to note is that if you're at 50%, you generally won't maintain 100% boon uptime on yourself. And this is because of the changes a while ago where Signet of Inspiration affects 10 members. So you're going to get 2 casts of Signet of Inspiration from your allies now, instead of just 4 casts from you. So with your other support Chronomancer using Signets of Inspiration, you should be able to maintain 100% uptime on Quickness and Alacrity. So basically, as I'm going through here, I just went through, I cycle about 3 times, then I can use Continuum Split again and do the exact same thing as my opener. And in this case, I can have many more clones up, allowing me to fit more stuff in. So I can use both the wells, I can use my Shield 4, I can use maybe Blurred Frenzy, and then I've got extra stuff that I've summoned and that I've used off cooldown. Or an extra stuff that'll be off cooldown when I come out. Alright, so that's your general rotation. So yeah, that's going to be the general rotation, and that is about going to wrap it up for this guide to Chronomancer. If you would like additional help in things, clarification on specific parts of Chronomancer, whether that's traits, gear, etc., feel free to drop a comment down below and ask, or again, you could ask on You could PM me on Discord, Guild Wars 2 Raid Academy, which is the raid server that I teach on. Or you could ask other people near you for clarification as well if they understand Chronomancer. But yeah, that's about going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you have suggestions for other things you would like to see, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. And I hope to be releasing more raid videos now that I have the time. So yeah, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers, guys.